So today I'm going to be talking about saving moral knowledge. So Immanuel Kant famously said, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." We're compelled to take a stand on ethical issues, maybe more than any other area of philosophy. Our moral convictions simply cannot be packed in a box and stored in the closet. And given their unavoidable nature, it's no surprise that ethical considerations have existed at the center of philosophical discussion since the beginning of thought. Regardless of your religious or political background, there are some things we know are just wrong, regardless of one's opinion of them. We might imagine the murder of 19 innocent school students in Uvalde on May 24th, or the recent kidnapping and raping of an 8-year-old girl at Knife Point in Pasadena. We cannot avoid our conviction that such acts are wrong, and I think it would be hard-pressed to say they aren't. But the question is, can we trust these moral convictions to be accurate? And that's what I want to discuss today. So I'll begin by defining what moral knowledge is, answering the question, what is moral knowledge? Then we'll look at how we might have moral knowledge. What criteria do we need to account for moral knowledge? And then we'll look at possible explanations to meet that criteria for moral knowledge. We'll look at one, a natural explanation, and then we'll look at a supernatural explanation. And we'll see which explanation better explains our ability to trust these moral convictions for knowledge. And then at the end, we'll look at the role of this argument in the broader scope of Christian apologetics. So let's begin with defining what moral knowledge is. So knowledge exists in a variety of forms. Okay, we might consider competence or know-how knowledge, such as knowing how to juggle, or acquaintance knowledge, such as knowledge of a friend, or Adam knowing Eve. However, these forms of knowledge are not relevant to the discussion of moral knowledge. The focus here is on propositional knowledge. For example, our knowledge that 1 added to 1 is 2, or that the United States of America is a country. More specifically, my concern is with moral propositions. These are statements such as torturing children for the fun of it is morally bad, or helping those in need is morally good. It's important to note that although it might not be known whether a particular proposition is true or false, each is either true or false. Moral realism says that moral propositions such as torturing children for the fun of it is morally bad, or helping those in need is morally good, are objectively true or false in the same way that 1 added to 1 is 2 is objectively true or false. So the question is, if these moral facts exist, such that torturing children for the fun of it is bad, or helping those in need is good, if these moral facts exist, how might we know them? There are 2 criteria necessary for any explanation of moral knowledge to fulfill. 1, objective moral truth exists. So moral truth must exist for us to have knowledge of them. And I'll assume this for the sake of the argument here. Secondly, humans have the capacity to acquire moral truths to some extent. So granted that we might not all agree on what moral truth is, we might believe that our capacities to know these truths might improve over time. We might imagine that we know more about moral truth when we are presented with a rational argument, or as we grow up, or as our mental capacities evolve and mature. And for this reason, it seems only fair that an account of moral knowledge does not require a full acquisition of moral truths, but rather a tracking which, to some extent, reflects moral truth. So in other words, we might not know all moral truths that exist, but we can agree and track some of them, which are more obvious, like torturing children for fun is bad. So this chart displays what I've outlined thus far. So as you can see, on one end, we have moral truth, and this exists independently of us knowing it. Okay, we might imagine torturing children for fun is morally bad. If you study any moral apologetics or ethics, this is often an example that's used. Torturing children for fun is morally bad. So this is a moral truth that exists independently of us knowing it. On the other end, we have our moral convictions. So this is our conviction that torturing children for fun is morally bad. This exists as a belief or conviction that we have. And in the middle, we have some sort of explanation, which ties our moral convictions back to moral truth. So to possess moral knowledge, we need an explanation for why we have the capacity to acquire moral truths. To further define this need for an explanation, let's look at quotes from two philosophers, both a theist and then a naturalist. First, the theist, Mark Linville. He says, both the evolutionary naturalist and the theist may be found saying that certain of our moral beliefs are byproducts of the human constitution. We think as we do largely as a result of our programming. Whether such beliefs are warranted would seem to depend upon who or what is responsible for the program. Then we have Sharon Street, who's a naturalist. And she says, if the fund of evaluative judgments with which human reflection began was thoroughly contaminated with illegitimate influence, then the tools of rational reflection were equally contaminated, for the latter are always just a subset of the former. So in order to explain how humans have the capacity to acquire moral truths to some extent, and show a dependence relationship or connection between moral truth and our moral convictions, it must be shown that this fund or explanation which produced our moral convictions is not contaminated or misleading, and thus there is no undercutting reason for distrusting our moral convictions. So what possible explanations do we have for our moral knowledge? What possible explanations do we have to explain that we can trust our moral convictions to be true? Well, we have a natural explanation, or we have a supernatural explanation. First, the natural explanation. As I use the term natural, I mean it in the way Democritus understood it. Simply, all that exists are atoms in the void. All that exists is matter and natural processes. So natural explanations of moral knowledge are explanations which attempt to fulfill or deny the criteria for moral knowledge using purely natural theories. Here I'll discuss evolutionary naturalism as the fund or explanation, which I will further define and address on the next slide. On the other hand, we'll have a supernatural explanation. So supernatural explanations of moral knowledge are accounts which attempt to fulfill the criteria for moral knowledge by appealing to a higher story via supernatural agent or abstract entities. Here I'll discuss how asserting the existence of God might explain our moral knowledge. So let's turn to a natural explanation. The first thing to consider when looking at a natural explanation is that the scientific theory of evolution does not imply naturalism. This is a common mistake made by people all over the realm of ethics and all over the realm of moral apologetics. The scientific theory of evolution does not imply naturalism. When I discuss evolutionary naturalism, I'm not addressing evolution as a scientific theory, but rather the idea that evolution was a purely natural process, which was unguided and consisted of purely natural events. The second thing, we need to define natural selection. Natural selection is based on the concept of random mutation, and it serves as the focal point for evolutionary naturalism. So, if you ever studied biology, here's a little refresher for you. If we assume the genes of a species undergo random mutations, selective pressures will ensure that in the long run, the mutations which are conducive to the survival and replication of the species will prevail. Okay? Just for an example, let's imagine that over time, species starts to grow wings, and it starts to grow a third leg. Well, in the environment that they're in, they need to use their wings more than they need to use their third leg. Well, eventually they'll lose that third leg and their wings will go stronger and stronger. And so the mutation of the wings will be the one that prevails. and then that species will end up having wings. So in the same way, this is how our moral convictions would have been formed on evolutionary naturalism. We've had moral convictions because they've helped us adapt to certain moral behaviors, helped us in aiding our herd or our tribe or whatever it might be. So the third point is that according to evolutionary biology, the fact that moral beliefs are correct has no influence on their selective potential. So according to evolutionary naturalism, our moral convictions were naturally selected for via their adaptiveness, not their truth value. I'll say that again. According to evolutionary naturalism, if evolution is a purely natural process, our moral convictions were naturally selected for via their adaptiveness, their ability to help human flourishing, or what have you, not their connection to truth or a mind-independent truth. So this sets the stage for my debunking argument against evolutionary naturalism as an explanation for moral knowledge. So as you saw, as we just affirmed on premise 1, our moral convictions were naturally selected for via their adaptiveness, not their truth value. Premise 2, if our moral convictions were naturally selected for via their adaptiveness, not their truth value, we don't hold our moral convictions because they are true, but because they are adaptive. Therefore, we cannot trust our moral convictions to be true. So the idea here is that even if our moral convictions about mind-independent moral facts are true, these beliefs cannot be counted as knowledge in virtue of an undercutting defeater, evolutionary naturalism. So because evolutionary naturalism is potentially misleading, it's only aimed at adaptiveness, not at leading us towards true moral beliefs. We cannot trust the moral convictions we have to be actually true. Those beliefs are only adaptive, so we cannot trust our moral convictions. So what are the implications of evolutionary naturalism given this debunking argument? It seems the most plausible alternative is to abandon evolutionary naturalism as an explanation for moral knowledge and accept the necessary conclusion that knowledge of such truths, if they exist, is rendered impossible. Even if something is objectively wrong, such as the torturing of innocent children, we would never be able to know. So the immediate problem the moral skeptic faces is that he cannot live without affirming his moral convictions. There's a book titled The Rate by Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer. And in the book, they kind of spell out the implications of such an evolutionary naturalistic view. They write, rape is not a pathology, rather is an evolutionary adaptation for maximizing reproductive success. For if candy and flowers don't do the trick, some men may resort to coercion and force to achieve the reproductive imperative. They go on to say, rape is simply a natural, biological phenomenon that is the product of the human evolutionary heritage, just like the leopard's spots in the giraffe's elongated neck. So just as the leopard has grown spots and the giraffe has a longer neck, we've developed an adaptation towards rape being wrong. There's nothing objectively wrong about it. It's just what we've evolved to have. So can you imagine if we actually lived like this was true? If we lived out this reality? You see, the inability to live apart from our moral convictions seems to present an issue for the proponent of evolutionary naturalism, whose most plausible conclusion is moral skepticism. Nonetheless, the more popular moral argument is not my focus here. Rather, my central concern is on the underlying challenges posed by the debunking argument I've given, which seem to reveal the undercutting nature of evolutionary naturalism to explain moral knowledge. So, now that we've seen that evolutionary naturalism doesn't provide a great explanation for moral knowledge, what about a supernatural explanation? What about asserting God's existence? Does that help us explain moral knowledge any better? Well, It seems so, and here's why. The theist might avoid the assertion of premise one of the debunking argument by appealing to divine guidance, or they could avoid the implications of the argument by asserting divine revelation. So remember premise one of the debunking argument I gave. It's there. Our moral convictions were naturally selected for via their adaptiveness, not their truth value. But given a guided evolutionary story, if God had guided the evolutionary story, we might imagine that God could have guided us towards true moral convictions, so that our convictions would not be aimed merely at adaptiveness, but at truth. Therefore, premise one of the debunking arguments would be proven wrong. But let's give the naturalist the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that our moral beliefs were aimed only at adaptiveness and not truth, that God hadn't had any reason to guide the evolutionary story. Can the theist or the proponent of a supernatural explanation avoid this? Well, I think so. It would seem in such a case that even if it is granted that our moral beliefs aimed only at adaptiveness and not truth, the theist could appeal to divine revelation. The idea that God communicated to us directly via our conscience or used special revelation to allow us to apprehend these moral facts. And this would help us avoid debunking concerns. Therefore, the theist can pick his avenue to avoid debunking challenges in a way the naturalist cannot. He can say that either God guided us towards true moral beliefs, and thus they weren't merely aimed at adaptiveness, or he can say even if our moral convictions were merely aimed at adaptiveness, God has given us some greater revelation now so that we might know moral truths either through our conscience or through special revelation. So the conclusion of this study has not meant to prove the existence of God. This is not an argument to prove the existence of God, let alone the Christian God. Rather, this conclusion is meant to show that knowledge of mind-independent moral facts is better explained by a supernatural explanation, or God, than by a natural explanation, evolutionary naturalism. So in short, only God can save moral knowledge. So when you go around and you hear people making moral claims, you see it in the news, you see it on TV, you see it with your friends at the cafeteria. He's wrong for doing that. Why would she do such a thing? These claims can only be rooted in God. If evolutionary naturalism is true, there is no basis for such claims. And if that, or helping those in need, is good, they cannot be rooted in evolutionary naturalism. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to have knowledge of them, and that claim is simply meaningless. It's simply someone spewing air out into the universe. But if God exists, then objective moral truth does exist, and we can have knowledge of it because he has guided either the evolutionary story or has given us some sort of revelation to give us true moral convictions. And so my hope is that this analysis will serve as a firm foundation for the moral argument for God's existence. I think this argument could serve as a vital part of a cumulative moral case for God, which might break down intellectual barriers and reveal the shortcomings of naturalism to the willing and the searching, so they might discover a worldview consistent with their moral convictions. For the theist, I hope this argument strengthens their intellect and broadens their concept of our good God. And so here I'll open it up to any questions we have if Bill wants to come up. But thank you very much.
I mean, wasn't it William Lane Craig that said that's the most powerful argument that you can use on a college campus, because everybody just tends to agree that humans have value and we ought to treat each other well and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to my aunt even this afternoon, and we were just talking about like how different areas of philosophy are more compelling than other ones. And like I said at the beginning of the talk today, I love the moral argument and I love ethics because it's unavoidable. You know, if you can live your whole life without worrying once about the cosmological argument or the ontological argument for God.
Speak for yourself.
Great. Well, they're great. They're great arguments, and I love the arguments. But you can live your daily life without thinking about them or without them impacting you in such a way. But when you hear the moral argument and you have moral considerations, they eat at you in a different way. You know, you can't go throughout your day without finding people making moral claims. I mean, you turn on the TV for 5 minutes and there's people making moral claims. You go to the cafeteria, there's people making moral claims. You know, you yourself find yourself getting angry about certain things or wanting justice. Those are all moral claims that you're thinking about. And so you can't pack that in a box and store it in the closet, as I always say. You can't avoid these sort of considerations.
So what would you say to somebody who says, well, we don't really need God to ground ethics. We can ground ethics, say, in just like a communal consensus, like the community's consensus of what is right and wrong. Like where do you think that would fall flat? If the majority of the United States of America thinks that you should not murder somebody or you're going to be possibly not only prosecuted, at least put in prison for life, at most be killed.
Yeah.
Is that not sufficient? You know, now I don't believe that, but
it's not sufficient if you're in the 40% or the 49%.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, when you look at arguments like that, you have to consider that we do live in God's world. You know, a lot of people try to talk about moral convictions and how they can exist without God while living in God's world. So like one of the arguments that you'll hear if you study ethics or moral apologetics is that, let's say that the Nazis had won World War II and taken over the world, and everybody agreed that killing people based on their race was good. Would it then be, because people agreed, would it then be good to do such a thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or we could imagine a situation where the majority agreed that killing anyone over the age of 70 was a good idea.
Yeah.
Because, we're paying their retirement in a lot of ways, so that's a burden on our economical status. We're paying their medical bills. We're having to take time to care for them. It's really they're a burden to society, so we could just kill them off. We could imagine a society where over 50% of the people think that's a good idea. And I think when you look at that, you just realize how dehumanizing that sort of thing is.
Yeah.
Where if we came to a societal vote,
yeah,
how dehumanizing that would be to our morality.
Yeah, it's good answer. Yeah, of course, everybody defaults to the Nazi answer. That's like
you hear that all the time. That's why I want.
Yeah, but no, it's plausible. I mean, that is one of the best examples, especially with your presentation, because Hitler was actually he cited naturalism as his reason to do what he did in Mein Kampf. That was part of his reason. So, yeah, but if naturalism's true and that's the foundation of our ethics, then it's all. It would be plausible to live that way. But thank God naturalism's not true and the foundation of our ethics.
And flourishing, we talk about human flourishing. We could say whatever is conducive to human flourishing is good. But flourishing is highly ambiguous. Who decides what flourishing is? Mm-hmm. Is it just those in power that get to decide what flourishing is? Yeah. And that causes a whole new slew of ethical concerns.
Yeah. So I'd like to open it up to Q&A. This is the, hope you're not nervous. You don't strike me as nervous.
I don't get that nervous.
So yeah.
Hello.
Hello. There we go.
Yeah, you're live. You're on.
Nice to meet you. My name is Daniel Sinesti.
Stick it up close to your mouth, though.
Closer. This better?
Yeah.
So my name is Daniel Sinesti, and it's nice to meet you today.
Nice to meet you.
So I really liked your idea about debunking. Wrote some notes down. So.
Cool. Awesome.
I was writing.
I love that.
Over naturalism, and I enjoyed your counsel. I I enjoyed your counter for it, but my issue was mainly with your idea of evolution itself, because it kind of seems, I haven't read the full book, I don't know, like, all the research, it kind of seems like you're working from a Lamarckian perspective of evolution. You know, and I thought it was just the one thing with the bird, but then you did it again with the leopard and then with the giraffe. So, when it comes to the bird, right, you described that bird, it said it had an extra wing, but slowly over time, like an extra leg, it said it had an extra wing, but slowly over time, like an extra leg and weak wing, but over time it would develop stronger wings and lose the third leg because they didn't need it. But that's not exactly how that would work. It would work because a lot of birds that did have that extra leg mutation would die. And then they would get stronger wings because they would already be pre-existing. And I think that does have implications, right? I think it has implications at the end of your argument. When you talked about, in particular, your example of rape, right? If I was a revolutionary naturalist, I believe that rape is wrong, not because it simply is, right? Or because there was a social vote, but because it was a concept it was simply a concept for an action that wasn't always considered wrong everywhere. In order for rape to be wrong, it's not just a societal vote, it's that a lot of people had to suffer in order for us to begin to consider that. And it comes from something. It's not that it is simply evil because it is evil. And that's just the alternative I give. I don't know if you meant to work with a different idea.
No, yeah, you're right. Um, the examples for evolution that I gave about the wing, that was just a simpler explanation because not everybody. You sound like you have some background in biology or evolution, or just looked into it.
I mean,
Yeah, so I don't think you have to be too particular about what theory of evolution you're talking about or how you're defining random mutation or natural selection. The bird example was just more of an example to get people to understand what a random mutation is.
yeah.
But I think that even if you take your example of, rape not coming down to a vote or anything like that, as Bill talked about, or rather you say that it was just something that we learned over time because of, people suffering and stuff. I think the argument still works because you could still say that. Well, I think you could still say that you don't have knowledge that rape is wrong. You've just learned it through evolution or an adaptation towards people suffering, and therefore it's not really aimed at truth. It's just what we've adapted to believe that rape is wrong.
I kind of agree that it's an adaptation, but I also still think that, how would I word this? I had it in my head a second. I think it's still important that it doesn't,
So I might help you. So you said that it's not necessarily objectively wrong, right?
No, that's not what I'm
Oh, okay.
trying to
I
say
thought you
is
said
that,
something like that.
can you repeat the last thing you said again? I'm sorry.
I said that it would still be, so if you say that rape was something that we had learned over time because people were suffering, and we learned not to do it. Yeah.
So I think so I would say that humans, what separates us, especially males, that we're naturally altruistic. We have perspective and the ability to put ourselves in someone else's perspective. It's not that we just decided that other people's suffering is wrong, it's that we learned that their suffering is equal to as if our suffering. And so that's why we decided it was wrong. It's our own understanding of everything. It's not necessarily that we chose it just because we chose it.
I see. Yeah, so I'd say that what your argument is against, so you're arguing saying that these aren't objective, right? Like that's not objective, it's just.
I'm arguing that it's not random, like you're trying to think that.
Oh, I don't, when I say random, I don't mean that it's like, it's not for a purpose. When I say random, I just mean that there's, so there's random mutations that occur, and then what's naturally selected is that which is conducive to flourishing or helps the species evolve towards, a better society or something like that. But the actual acts of like rape or rape or killing people for fun, like those haven't evolved randomly. Like those have evolved because those are things that help society flourish, right? Like you said, like not raping somebody, it definitely helps society flourish. I can see reasons how it would help humanity flourish. If you say like not murdering 1 million people for fun, I can see how that would evolve through evolution, through a herd mentality of like, we need to protect our tribe, we need to protect our people. Why would we do that? So it's not like these things would not like these moral convictions are random. It's just that if they've evolved by natural processes, there's no way we would know that they actually track objective moral truths if they even exist.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No, I got it at the very end. If you can
Okay. Okay. If it doesn't make sense, I mean, you can ask more. I'd love to talk to you, but.
No, if you're not going to had a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, but like I said, the word random wasn't meant to say that if evolutionary naturalism is true, then our moral convictions are random. That's not what I was saying. I was just trying to explain what natural selection was in a brief way by saying that random mutation, natural selection. But we can definitely see how moral convictions we have would help us flourish as a society for sure. And that would be the idea. If evolutionary naturalism is true, the moral convictions would be because we've learned them, and that's how societies learn to flourish.
Cool. Tim, before you get started, Braden, could you hold the microphone for us just so if you're not used to holding a microphone and talking, the tendency is to pull it away from your mouth. We need to get a microphone stand, but Braden, could you just make sure that Tim is talking into the microphone constantly? Because we got people on Zoom that cannot hear apart from that thing.
I got you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so much of the force of your argument seems to be working under the assumption that survivability and truth are not one and the same.
That what are not one and the same?
That survivability and truth are not one and the same.
Correct.
It seems, though, that the evolutionary naturalists to come back and simply say that in the long run, if you are not acting in a manner that corresponds with truth, you will not survive. So couldn't they say that maybe in the short term that's correct, but in the long term, survivability and truth will go hand in hand?
I guess I would struggle to see what basis they have to think that survivability would contribute, would match up with truth. It seems they really wouldn't. It's a good question. I just think that there'd be no real way of knowing, because you would never really know what truth is, and you'd never know that your moral convictions are true. And I think that's kind of the idea, is that our moral convictions on evolutionary naturalism could be true. Like it's like I think about sometimes is like picking the winning lottery numbers. So let's say I pick the winning lottery numbers, but I never know what the winning lottery numbers are. My numbers could be the winning numbers, but I never know because there's nothing that connects me to knowledge of that truth or trusting that my numbers are true. It's not like somebody has always given me the winning numbers and therefore I put the winning numbers down so I know that they're the winning numbers. So in the same way on evolutionary naturalism, we could have moral convictions that are true, but we just wouldn't be able to know it. And I think that's more the problem, is like, if the evolutionary naturalists were to say that truth and survival value are one and the same, I think I don't see how that answers the question, because they still wouldn't know that survival value is true. If that makes sense.
I guess, I know Alan Plantinga in the evolutionary argument against naturalism discusses like the probabilities and all that of your truth claim being accurate. So it just seems like you could have a genuine knowledge claim in which you could say something such as murder, which has been like taboo in most societies for quite a long time, that given its presence in so many communities over such a long period of time, that it would be true. Okay. I guess, and this is operating in the assumption that you can't really survive if you're not operating under the truth, but that seems like a relatively safe assumption. In which case you could just say that, probability speaking, at least for those beliefs that have been held for over a long period of time, I'm justified in believing it's true.
Yeah, I think that when you say truth, do you mean usefulness? Like whatever's useful to survival?
No, I'm saying that I don't think you're going to survive if you're not acting in a way that corresponds to reality.
if you're not acting. Yeah, so I would say that would be an argument from like usefulness. So if you don't act in a way that is useful, you won't survive. But it's no saying that usefulness allows us to have knowledge of moral truths. Just because something is useful doesn't mean that it's, morally true. We can find a lot of things that end up being useful that aren't conducive to moral truth or moral knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that argument that you give, like from usefulness, is more of an argument against moral realism, like the idea that moral truth actually exists, than it is more about moral knowledge. So for my sake of the argument, I just assume that moral truth does exist. So I'm saying that if moral truth does exist, then given evolutionary naturalism, we would never be able to trust our moral convictions to be true. But if moral truth doesn't exist, then we can't have moral knowledge anyway. Like if you're saying if moral truth doesn't even exist, then there's no way we could even have moral knowledge. So there's no point in even talking about, what a best explanation is for moral knowledge. You know what I mean? So I think that argument from usefulness is, it's one that is more in the realm of, moral realism, and an argument against moral realism to say that, what's useful is, morally good, and what's not useful is morally bad, than it is to undercut the argument from evolutionary naturalism for moral knowledge. Because I think you mentioned Planning's argument, and I'm hard pressed to to go against Planning's argument because I don't know enough about it. And so I just trust Alvin Planning that he's somewhat right. But as far as moral knowledge goes, I think that it's safe to say if this moral truth exists, well, so like if there's some way that there's actually objective moral truths, then if we evolved purely by evolutionary naturalism and naturalistic processes, our moral convictions would be aimed at adaptiveness, which helped our society evolve. And so they're not necessarily aimed at truth. What connection this evolution would have towards truth and how they'd be connected, I think that's an assumption that is very difficult to prove. Like, I imagine saying like, we learn that if we see that rape is wrong over time, then that all of a sudden becomes true that rape is wrong over time. I don't think it becomes true. I just think it becomes what's useful, becomes adaptive. In which a way I think an evolutionary naturalist would say that same thing. But he would also, and so he would say we can't have moral knowledge, and he would agree with the argument, but he'd also say, well, there's no such thing as moral truth. So instead of going against that second criteria I had up there earlier, I think it would be more against the first criteria to say there's no such thing as moral truth. It's just what's useful, So that's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your talk. So the atheist Pete Boghossian, in his manual for creating atheists, addresses the moral argument, and he says basically we all have to believe in some kind of brute facts, some things that sort of they just are. They don't need any reason or explanation outside of themselves. Like for theists, God is a brute fact. He just is. He's self-existent. There is no reason outside of himself for his existence. And Peter Boghossian asks, why can't this be true of morals? Why not just say morals are brute facts? We just know deep down that they're true. It's so have to explain them. Like, what if a theist can say God is a brute fact? Why can't atheists just say morality is a brute fact?
Yeah, so this is an argument that's given. I'm trying to remember the name. Somebody who gives it. The person who gives it. I can't remember. But yeah, so the claim here is that, if anybody didn't hear, that why can't we just, a lot of people have to come to some sort of fundamental reality, right? Like that God is a brute fact, that he exists. And then other people would say, well, the naturalists would say, well, why can't we just say that God is a brute fact, or that, what do you say, morality is a brute fact, that these moral facts just exist? And I think it kind of takes, so if you look at evolutionary naturalism, as I've described it, there's no way on evolutionary naturalism to assume any sort of brute fact. You would have to appeal to some sort of like Platonic idea of the existence of these abstract entities, such like that these propositions, such that torturing children for fun of it is morally bad, just exists, right? It's just like some sort of thing that exists that somehow attaches itself to us. Because on evolutionary naturalism, our ideas are just neurons firing in our brain. They're nothing more than that, because all that exists is the natural world. So to account for brute facts on such a view, it begs the question of where do they come from? And so if you say that these things exist on their own, apart from us, then you have this question of, well, how do they attach themselves to us? If they just exist out there, how do they attach themselves to us some way? And so there, I think you run into a similar problem that I described, where you need some sort of agent or some sort of connection that we have to our moral truth, that our moral convictions have to our moral truths. Because otherwise, you're just dealing with purely molecules in your brain that are telling you certain things. And why are the molecules firing in my brain any more reliable than the molecules firing in Bill's brain if we disagree about a moral dilemma? So I think that on evolutionary naturalism, again, we can't trust our moral convictions to be aimed at truth if they're merely aimed at survival and replication, which evolutionary naturalism tells us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you were focusing on evolutionary naturalism in your talk, but what about, I know this is rare, but what about, let's say an atheist says, I'm not a naturalist, I'm a Platonic idealist, I just don't believe in gods. Like,
Yeah.
I think they could be coherent.
Well, you'd be surprised how common that is.
Yeah, you're right. And I did want to talk about that. So that's something that I do address further. Like when I was writing my thesis, I addressed those sort of ideas. Today I chose just to look at evolutionary naturalism. But you're absolutely right that naturalism is defined in a lot of different ways. If you noticed in the talk today, I talked about how I define naturalism as all that exists as atoms in the void. And other people define naturalism differently. They would include abstract entities in naturalism. I'm not sure that that's a traditional way to define naturalism, as you said, but certainly some people do it. But again, even if you do that, you have to say that there's some sort of way that these abstract identities attach themselves to us or to our minds somehow. And unless you say that these things have causal powers in and of themselves, like these moral propositions exist mind independently and have causal powers in and of themselves, you have to posit some sort of agent that's causing these things to come into being, if we're going to track them truly. Now, if you want to say that, and I always say that I'm open to this based on this argument, but everybody says, no, whatever. But if these abstract entities exist, like, torturing children for fun of it is morally bad, that could definitely exist in mind independently. But again, if we are purely, if we evolved purely by evolutionary naturalism, still our beliefs will only be merely aimed at adaptiveness and not connecting us to truth. So they could exist out there, but we still wouldn't be able to know them unless there's some sort of agent that connects us to them. So we could be right just on a lucky guess, or that evolution got really lucky and landed us at true moral beliefs, but we would never be able to know that we were right unless we posit some sort of agent explanation or God. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question.
Um, you know Peter Singer, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It seems like Peter Singer is somebody who is trying to take evolutionary naturalism to its logical extreme,
Yeah.
and yet at the same time, I still think he's working within a moral framework. Can't get around it. Whatever you want to say about Peter Singer.
Yeah. Peter Singer is a philosopher that I like because there's a lot of like when you say you like these atheistic philosophers, these naturalistic philosophers, Christians say, "What are you doing? Why would you like them?" Aaron knows that. But it's like,
That college has ruined you.
yeah, what did you go to that college and now you like all these naturalist philosophers? But I like him because in some ways he's intellectually honest. I appreciate that. I appreciate that about Michael Roos. I appreciate that about E.O. Wilson. These guys Friedrich Nietzsche was intellectually honest. He said, we're just going to face our despair with courage and, go for it.
Dare we even say Sam Harris was trying to reach out that direction too?
I don't know if that's, but,
I didn't mean to make you mad. Sorry.
No, that's fine. But yeah, I appreciate intellectually honest philosophers.
Okay.
And what I mean is that
Good distinction there.
they follow the evidence, the evidence where it leads to its logical conclusion. And the issue though with morality, like Peter Singer and some others, is that they can't live it out, and that's the thing about moral realism and our moral convictions. They seem deliberatively indispensable. What I mean by that is we cannot live without them. It's very difficult for someone to say, moral relativism is true, or moral skepticism is true, and then live like it's not. They're still operating according to some framework that it is true, but like if somebody had come up and killed somebody in their family, for example, they'd say, that's horribly wrong. You should never do that in any circumstance for anybody. They wouldn't just say, well, like E.O. Wilson's a big guy about how morality is just neurons firing in our brain. And I'm sure he wouldn't just say, oh, well, the neurons firing in their brain caused them to do that. And that's just how it is. As a determinist, it's like, okay, yeah, they wouldn't say that. And the reason is because we live in God's world. We can't escape these moral convictions. And that's why I love the moral argument. And I love ethics, is because you can't escape this from day to day. And you see these guys who are in ethics, who are naturalists, and they're moral skepticism, they're moral skeptics, moral relativists, and yet they'll still operate according to some moral framework, or they still live by some moral framework. They'll say that something is wrong or something is bad. And they'd be hard pressed to justify why it's just according to their society, but they attempt to do so on paper, but it's very difficult when you face the real world because you live in God's world. So I always find that interesting, but I do appreciate a good, intellectually honest atheist. I appreciate that.
But even the most intellectually honest atheist, if they tried to use that defense in the court of law, that neurons are firing in my brain, that's why I robbed that bank or shot and killed that person.
Yeah.
The judge would look at you and be like, okay, well, your neurons caused you a life sentence. It's like I don't find that a compelling defense. I never have.
Yeah, I was determined to kill my neighbor. You were determined to a life sentence.
Yeah.
I accept.
Yeah. That's okay. That's no need for lawyers.
That's the idea with determinism and stuff.
Yeah.
But again, I haven't looked. My main study is not with moral realism. It's more with moral knowledge. How we come to moral knowledge. I assume moral realism because moral realism has been a debate for since the beginning of thought. To put something into moral realism that's going to make a huge impact is difficult. Obviously, the conversation has to continue. Obviously, there's debate that needs to be had. There's debate that's being had right now on moral realism, whether objective moral facts exist or not. But my focus is more on if moral facts exist, I want you to know that, like if the naturalist says moral facts do exist, then you could say, well, if they exist, you wouldn't be able to have knowledge of them. So can you really affirm that they exist if you don't have knowledge of them? What's your basis to affirm that they exist if you were simply a result of biological, evolutionary naturalism. Your moral convictions are just a result of evolutionary naturalism. So how are you affirming moral realism as a naturalist? It becomes very difficult. And so then they'll resort to some sort of moral skepticism or moral relativism to the culture or something like that. But I think over time, that sort of argument kind of eats at people where they realize, okay, well, these moral truths actually do exist. And when I accept that moral truths do exist, now I know the implications of that view.
Very good. Any closing thoughts, Hunter, that you can take us out with? Next few minutes. What would you recommend to a student that would want to pursue this kind of study, this kind of path?
Yeah.
They are where they are right now.
Ask a lot of questions. When you go to church, when you go to school, when you're in class, ask a lot of questions. And don't think that everybody always says, don't think that any question is a stupid question. Bill, you've always said they're stupid questions, but.
No, I said they're stupid people.
Oh yeah, that's right. Just wanted to get that quote right. There's not stupid questions, there's stupid people. No, but no. But there's not any question that is stupid if you're trying to grow in your faith. I mean, ask the fundamental questions. If you don't know, what is a Christian? Ask what is a Christian? What can God do this? Whatever. Why does the Bible say this? Whatever. If it's against Christianity, who cares? That's even better. Ask those questions, explore them, and don't stop until you find an answer that you're content with. That's another thing. People are afraid to ask questions, so they suppress them, and then they think that there's no answer, so they end up just assuming that there's not. Or they ask a question, they get a really poor answer to their question, and so they're just like, okay, there must just be a bad answer. I mean, luckily at HCU, we have professors who are super great. You can ask any question and give you all the answers. But, you're not always you don't always have those resources. People get questions wrong. If you ask a pastor a question, he could tell you something and it's completely wrong. If you're not content with the answer, look further, because most often there's probably another person who's giving a different answer. The other thing I would say is read both sides of everything. Mm-hmm. When I was doing research for this stuff, I read way more naturalists than I did theists. You have to do that. You have to know both sides of the argument. If you're just reading Christian books, or you're just reading, arguments in favor of God, that's great to know those things, but be ready for the objections. Understand that to every argument, there's counter arguments.
Yeah.
So when you see a great argument for God, you see the Kalam cosmological argument, you see the moral argument, and you're like, that's a great argument. Make sure you look up the opposing views and really think critically about why those things are wrong. A lot of Christians don't say that. They don't say read the atheists. But I'm saying read the atheist arguments. Go read Darwin. Go read, Alexander Rosenberg from Duke University. Go read these guys and see what they have to say. Because if you're on an honest journey for truth, you'll read anybody.
Yeah, I think the only adage I would make to that is, if you're young in your faith, if you just become a Christian, then read the philosophers and apologists that are Christian. Get a little bit of a foundation, get in discipleship under some great Christian thinkers, but never be afraid to read people outside of your, I've got a love for Muslim apologetics, but I don't have a whole lot of love for Muslim apologists sometimes.
And
I'd much rather listen to what an Islamic person says about somebody who's following Islam to the teeth, what they believe and how they interpret things, and then what some guy thinks they might believe. Or
once you read your atheist, take your concerns, take your what you think is very compelling about their argument, and then take it back to your Christian source. Mm-hmm. Take it back to a professor here at HCU. We have a top 3 school of Christian thought in the entire country. Top 2. I think number 1.
Yeah.
Those Californians can just.
Yeah.
But I think number 1. So take it to one of them, email them, ask them. Don't be afraid to ask the question and search for answers, because that's the way you're going to grow in your faith. You're going to grow in your intellect. And if you're not a Christian, read both sides, ask questions, explore. The fact that you're here is awesome. One of my favorite writers that I researched, Thomas Bogardus, says, he says, if you are a closed off atheist, he says, you'll never be convinced by any argument. He says, it doesn't matter what argument I give you. If you're a closed off atheist, you're not in a real search for truth. But the same thing goes for Christians. If you're a closed off Christian, you're not in a real search for truth. The only way to strengthen your faith and have a real strong faith is to look at both sides.
Yeah.
You know, and he always says, I'm reaching out to the wish I believe.
Yeah.
You know, those people who said, I wish I believed.
Yeah.
But there's just not enough evidence.
Yeah.
That kind of spirit's a great spirit to have when you're searching for answers.
I always feel like when you have a conversation with people like that, and that's your heart, you just want to know truth, you want to know where they're coming from. I've noticed that I can learn something from anybody.
Everybody knows something you don't.
Exactly. And I think we ought to try to cultivate that spirit, not just within Raphael Christi, but as a Christian culture. You know, like even though somebody, we might just adamantly disagree with somebody, but still might learn something if we come into the conversation respectfully and honestly.
Yeah.
And not call people stupid like I just did a minute ago.
Yeah. I mean, when we have a conversation with somebody, you have to realize either they're right and you're right and they're wrong, or we're both wrong, but we both can't be right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so when you hear those conversations and they say, well, we're both saying the same thing, or we're both right, make sure that you're weary of that. You know, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to hold strong to what you believe, you know, but be open to asking questions, understanding where other people come from, understand their story, why they believe what they believe.
Very good.
Yeah.
You guys would, let's give our guest Hunter Kallay another round of applause. Appreciate all you've done for, I'll say this personally, appreciate all you've done for our program. It's been a pleasure sitting next to you in several classes and hearing you very tactfully answer some of the crazy things we've heard. So, not from our professors, but
Yeah.
so and Aaron's been there too. And so we sometimes we're like,
Yeah.
Hunter's got that answer, but everybody's like, glad you're here, buddy.
That's funny.
But I've always appreciated your tact, your respect for people, your hunger for the truth and knowledge, and I'm looking forward to seeing where you end up, wherever that may be. I know it's going to be in the center of God's will because I know it's your heart. So appreciate you coming and being with us, brother. And that concludes for tonight. I'd like to